Sorry, folks, I was delayed a moment. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Our topic for tonight is a foreign policy failure. Specifically, Joe Biden's foreign policy failure. We know about his failures in relation to Ukraine. That, of course, has been a major failure. But, of course, the Israel-Gaza war is another major failure. So I'm going to start with some aspects of the Israel-Gaza war that you may not have had a chance to pay attention to, but which I want to call attention to here. My first piece for tonight is a piece from The Cradle, .co. It's by Khalil Harb from January 17th, 2024. When all else fails, Israel kills. While there may be a short-term emotional yield from scoring an enemy kill, Israel's decades-long assassinations policy has always been deeply counterproductive. Despite more than 2,700 targeted kills under its belt, Tel Aviv now faces the most formidable opponents in its bloody history. And there is a photograph of a recent Hamas leader whose life was snuffed out by the Israelis. The recent surge in Israeli assassinations throughout West Asia is an integral part of the war it is waging in Gaza. Looks like that's Dee coming in, so I'm going to let her in.
Hello.
Hello, Dee. What we're talking about here tonight is Joe Biden's foreign policy failure. And we started with an account of the Israeli policies, of assassination. The article is called "When All Else Fails, Israel Kills."
That's true.
So I will go back to that article. The recent surge in Israeli assassinations throughout West Asia is an integral part of the war it is waging on Gaza. Extrajudicial murders that are both directly and indirectly endorsed by its primary U.S. sponsor. Under pressure by the United States to fix the, quote, optics, unquote, of their Gaza genocide, the Israelis are implementing a partial withdrawal from the ground and reducing the frequency of airstrikes on North Gaza, Phase 1, and South Gaza, Phase 2. Having failed to rout Hamas from the Gaza Strip, a stated war objective, Tel Aviv's Phase 3 is geared around scoring wins where it can. In this case, the targeted killings of senior officials within the region's axis of resistance, which goes far beyond Gaza, of course. This new wave of assassinations, hello, Steve. I did notice that you have arrived. Glad to see you. So, this new wave of assassinations commenced in Damascus on the 25th of December 2023 with the killing of Brigadier General Razi Mousavi, a military advisor to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. It was followed on the 2nd of January with targeted drone strikes on Beirut, murdering Salah al Aruri, deputy head of the Hamas political bureau and a founding commander of the resistance group's uh, military wing. But while these killings are linked to the war in Gaza, they're also part of a long-standing Israeli policy of assassinations, extending beyond the Palestinian territories to various global cities, from Tunis to Dubai, from London to Athens, Paris, Rome, Brussels, Vienna, and Nicosia, okay, among others. I seem to remember there may even have been an assassination in New York sometime during the 1970s, but I don't really remember. Israel's covert assassinations by legacy. Israel's history of more than 2,700 such extrajudicial killings is detailed, okay, is Ronan Bergman's 2018 book, Rise and Kill First: The Secret History of Israel's Targeted Assassinations, underscores its reputation as arguably the most voracious assassination machine in history. While these acts often violated the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states and were a blatant violation of international law, they were often a product of coordination and collaboration with foreign nations, most notably in Europe. In some instances, the notorious Israeli intelligence services were assassins for hire. Bergman's book sheds light on the Mossad's alleged involvement in helping King Hassan II uh, um, in Morocco, okay, eliminate opposition leader Mehdi Ben Barka in 1965. The startling frequency and nature of Israel's assassinations of Palestinian resistance leaders in the post-Oslo Accords era reveals Tel Aviv's callous disregard for its political and security negotiation partners. The Israeli bypassed any understandings or agreements struck with the Palestinian Authority to kill perceived, even peaceful foes, opportunistically, rather than in response to any immediate threat. The Gaza Strip, a focal point of Israel's assassinations in the past few decades, witnessed a relentless pace even before Hamas emerged victorious in the 2006 elections. 4 years earlier, in 2002, Al-Qassam Brigade's commander-in-chief, Salah Shaheda, was murdered alongside his family with a one-ton bomb dropped by an F-16 plane on a densely populated neighborhood in Gaza City. In Gaza, the occupation state has long adopted a strategy of, quote, mowing the grass, formulated by Ephraim Inbar and Eitan Shamir as, quote, a patient military strategy of limited goals to diminish the opponent's capacity to harm Israel and to accomplish temporary deterrence, unquote. In essence, the policy is bombarding Gaza just enough, with some measure of frequency, to retard the Gaza Strip's military and civilian development, despite years of, quote, mowing the Palestinian grass, a strategy that spares no distinction between politicians, diplomats, fighters, or intellectuals. Tel Aviv has failed to break the will of the Palestinian resistance. Notably, the number of assassinations against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the PIJ, in the past 2 decades surpasses those murdered in Israel's much longer conflict with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, since the 1960s. In short, decades of targeted political killings have resulted in the unprecedented resistance-led Operation Al-Aqsa flood of 7th of October. So why would doubling down on its assassination tactics achieve anything of value for Israel? Between the two recent assassinations in Damascus and Beirut, Shin Bet head Ronan Bar threatened to pursue Hamas leaders, quote, in every location, unquote, including Lebanon, Qatar, and in Turkey. Israel's open discourse about its hit list, quote unquote, reflects the occupation state's long-standing sense of immunity from international law, and it is this lack of global pushback that partially explains why Tel Aviv has kept the unsuccessful policy in play. The fact is, while able to impose some setbacks to the Palestinian national liberation movement, which burns stronger than ever before, uh, I'm sorry, Israel's Murder Incorporated has utterly failed to extinguish the flames of resistance, which burn stronger than ever before. The proof lies in the pudding. A full 76 years after the Nakba al-Aqsa flood has triggered Israel's longest, costliest, and most personally devastating war in the state's history, a testament to the fact that Palestinians will endure their struggle no matter what. If anything, Israel's assassinations over the past 3 decades have yielded deeply counterproductive results. The 1992 extrajudicial murder of Hezbollah's former Secretary General Abbas al-Musawi increased the Lebanese resistance group's popularity and hardened its resolve to overthrow the Israeli occupation. It achieved exactly that under Musawi's successor, the uber charismatic Hassan Hassan Nasrallah, who ultimately forced the humiliating withdrawal of Israeli forces from southern Lebanon and is possibly the most feared Arab leader among Israelis today. Similarly, the 1995 assassination of Palestinian Islamic Jihad founder Fathi el-Shakaki on the island of Malta strengthened the movement, transforming it into one of the most formidable and committed resistance factions in Palestinian history. 2004 assassination of Hamas founder Sheikh Ahmed Yassin likewise bolstered the resistance group's reputation among Palestinians, forced Israel's 2005 withdrawal from a territory, and then propelled Hamas to unprecedented political power when it swept the 2006 elections and assumed total control of the Gaza Strip. The pivotal question now revolves around whether the renewed phase of assassinations will restore the prestige Israel lost, possibly permanently, following the Al-Aqsa flood. Reviving a failed policy amid a regional war. Hezbollah's initial and prompt response to the assassination of Arouri in Beirut's southern suburb was to bombard Israel's critical Meron military base with a salvo of 62 rockets, a base that acts as a key control point of Israel's Air Force and its main surveillance center for the region. But Tel Aviv's murder of a top Hamas official, therefore, created an immediate disadvantage for its military flexibility and allowed its biggest adversary to set new deterrence lines. Importantly, it signaled that Hezbollah, although hesitant to initiate war, refuses to fear one. And despite numerous Hezbollah operations in northern occupied Palestine, it also drew attention to Israel's hesitancy or inability to respond in kind. In the middle of a domestic political crisis that predates Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's extremist coalition government is exploiting unconditional U.S. support for its Gaza war to chest thump about escalating its aggression regionally. Simultaneously, it is contracting its war according to a commitment to the Biden administration by transitioning the war to a third phase in which it will seek to rehabilitate its globally damaged image by focusing on stealthier, more targeted special operations that include assassinations. The alarming aspect of this new phase is Washington's multifaceted role as the official sponsor of the genocide in Gaza. Besides providing political, military, and diplomatic cover and weapons for Israel, the U.S. is aggressively ratcheting up its regional intervention. The White House is working overtime to control the Lebanese front, contain Iraqi resistance factions by killing Nujaba movement leader, whose name is Mushtaq Talib al-Saidi, and force new U.S.-Israeli deterrence terms on Yemen in the face of Ansar Allah naval operations against Israeli-linked vessels, in the Red Sea. Of course, the nickname of Ansar Allah, is the Houthis. Their formal name, is Ansar Allah. The expanding regional war is therefore already allegedly employing new dirty tactics such as assassinations, terrorist attacks in Iran's Kerman, with Tehran's requisite assertive response, and the reactivation of U.S.-backed terrorist cells as exemplified by the resurgence of ISIS attacks in Iraq, Syria, and potentially in Lebanon. Yes, we, the U.S., are allied with ISIS in those regions now. Crucially, Ali Shamkhani, a political advisor to the leader of the Islamic Republic, whose name is Ali Khamenei, highlights that terrorism is Israel's new tool for waging a gray zone war and achieving deceptive gains, while emphasizing the resistance is determined to neutralize this tool. It is worth considering, however, that in the realm of irregular warfare, quote unquote, which the U.S. Pentagon has gamed against Iran and its alliance in countless virtual military exercises, the Americans have never won unless they rig the game or cheat. but we are not in a virtual reality conflict. This war is very real, and the rules cannot be changed on a whim when the U.S. team suffers a setback. I thought that article was enormously insightful and was a point of view we don't hear much about, and was about a subject that we do not hear much about.
No.
Okay, I'm sure there was a lot there that was new to folks, okay, who were listening to this, uh, and probably had little idea that the Israelis engage uh, in systematic assassinations to maintain their position, okay, in West Asia,
Oh, definitely.
and also to help the U.S. to maintain its position in West Asia too, because it's clear that even though the Israelis are performing the assassinations, which are one of their main capability in carrying out war, in doing these assassinations, they're also helping to maintain, okay, the position of the United States in the region, okay, by killing, okay, the leadership of the activist elements, okay, in the population.
Mm-hmm.
A score of 2,700, okay, is very impressive because these are often very high level leaders. And this has certainly had the effect. While I do agree with the article that uh, this campaign has been very counterproductive in some respects, it is hard to ignore the damage it has done to the leadership cadres, okay, of the resistance parties. Uh, we have to emphasize again that targeted assassinations, okay, for reason of opposing people politically, is against international law. Okay, it's a war crime, and so you have these war crimes considered continuing over 76 years as a systematic tool of what is supposed to be a civilized state, and that one that claims it operates according to international law. And meanwhile, it's carrying out 2,700 assassinations.
It's like a it's like a mafia type of thing.
Absolutely, it's a mafia type thing. Okay, on to the next piece. Steve Wolfbrand has some interesting comments, which we will get to later. Here's another piece from the Cradle. The West Bank is a ticking time bomb. With army protected Jewish extremists running riot through Palestinian towns, and the deeply unpopular U.S. Palestinian Authority holding on to its reins, the West Bank is primed for a seismic explosion that will transform into Israel's next war front. This one is by the Cradle's correspondent, okay, in Lebanon, who is not identified. Uh, this was done on January 15th, 2024. And you are seeing a settler gunman pictured here. The West Bank cities of Tulkarm and Nablus and Kalkilia, okay, and Ramallah, okay, all identified in the part of the picture I'm highlighting. Okay, here is another settler activist, evidently carrying a baton to hit people with. Uh, Someone else carrying a hatchet. I can't tell if that's a policeman or not.
Oh, you're not up in the room.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. I did not put that up in the room. I didn't hit the share button. I had it set up, but I didn't hit the share button.
Okay.
So there is the picture again. Here is the settler gunman. I'm not sufficiently expert to identify the gun. Uh, okay, here is another settler, hoodlum carrying a baton to hit people with. Here is somebody carrying a hatchet. This is superimposed on Israeli settlement structures, which are overlooking Palestinian towns. Quite a graphic there. Okay, so alongside the military assault on Gaza, extremist religious parties in Israel's government coalition seized a strategic opportunity after Operation Al Aqsa Flood to launch a systematic displacement agenda in the occupied West Bank. In other words, ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. This stealthy policy was facilitated by several factors,
Mm-hmm.
notably the escalation of settler violence post 7th of October, increased political pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the vice like leverage that settler extremists enjoy over the ruling coalition in Israel and key governmental institutions, particularly the Ministry of Finance. The Minister of Finance is Bezalel Smotrich, as we know. As an example, nearly 250 million of the national budget earmarked for more expenses in December 2023 was directed by Israel's radical finance minister, the aforementioned Bezalel Smotrich, towards settlement projects in the West Bank. Okay, immediately after its announcement, the EU criticized the settlement-funded provisions of the revised budget, rightly arguing that the expansion of illegal Israeli settlements and the forced displacement of Palestinians undermines security in the occupied West Bank and will not make Israel safer. Silent war in the West Bank. In response, Tel Aviv significantly tightened its grip on West Bank Palestinians. This involved obstructing Palestinian workers from employment in Israel, the finance minister's refusal to transfer Palestinian clearance funds to the Palestinian Authority to pay Gaza's workers' salaries. On the military front, Israel has launched a frenzied campaign on the West Bank since the 7th of October, resulting in the death of hundreds and arrest of over 6,000 Palestinians. Acts of violence, forced displacement of civilians, and armed settler attacks enabled by weapons transfers from Israel's extremist National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir escalated dramatically across the occupied territory. Ben-Gvir, who fronts the hidden agenda of nationalist and religious parties in the coalition government, used the Al Aqsa flood events to displace 25 Palestinian Bedouin communities, including 266 families in the eastern foothills near Ramallah and the Jordan Valley. Already this year, under pressure from his extremist allies, Netanyahu has halted the demolitions of illegal Jewish outposts in the West Bank, going against the recommendation of Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who was trying to ease tensions in the West Bank while conflict rages on Israel's northern and southern fronts. In early January, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir publicly called for the displacement of Gazans to make way for the return of Zionist settlers to the Gaza Strip for the first time since their 2005 expulsion. Their belligerent comments sparked a new rift with the U.S. administration of Joe Biden, which has sharply criticized, quote, inflammatory and irresponsible, unquote, um, um, rhetoric from Tel Aviv. Blinken's mission in Ramallah. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's recent visit with Palestinian Authority President um, um, Mahmoud Abbas was not primarily focused on post-war discussions on Gaza, as Washington has widely suggested, but on curbing a conflagration in the West Bank. The occupied Palestinian territory is today a ticking time bomb that could explode at any moment over any incident, small or large, and which could jeopardize frantic U.S. attempts to defuse and manage the military escalation on the borders of Lebanon. Blinken's key objective was to exert pressure on the Palestinian Authority, which governs the West Bank, to prevent and quash any popular Palestinian uprising that could lead to the opening of a third war front against Tel Aviv. Last week, Israeli security and military authorities intensified their warnings to cabinet members, urging Netanyahu to de-escalate tensions to avert a third intifada, which the Israeli army may struggle to contain while heavily distracted with Gaza, Lebanon, and the significant economic impact from Yemen's shipping blockade. Okay, the U.S. and Israel, according to this article, are not on the same page. Okay, the U.S. is up against a highly pressured timeline as it gears up for the upcoming presidential elections, despite its effort to find temporary band-aid solutions for the regional unrest unleashed by Tel Aviv's war on Gaza. Washington finds itself increasingly entangled in a West Asian quagmire, courtesy of its recent airstrikes uh, um, um, on Yemen. What greatly bothers the White House is that its Israeli ally appears to be frustratingly unconcerned with this American dilemma, with Netanyahu far more focused on his personal political future and the radical agenda of his coalition partners, an agenda not aligned with overall U.S. interests. Despite persistent warnings about the volatile situation in the West Bank, the Israeli Prime Minister refuses to pressure his allies, fearful of their repeated threats to abandon his coalition government. The U.S. cannot afford a West Bank military escalation because of the major repercussions this may have on its post-war proposals for Gaza and on its domestic political scene. The Palestinian Authority, now deeply unpopular among its own Palestinian constituents, is also a crucial component of U.S. projects in West Asia, many overlapping with various regional agendas. Since the start of the current war, the U.S. has sought to involve the Palestinian authorities in the post-war political rehabilitation of Gaza, in alignment with several Arab and Western countries, as a preliminary step toward resuming talks for a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. The path to a, quote, just peace has become unquote, has become a key element in discussions between Washington and Riyadh. That's, of course, the capital of Saudi Arabia, which the latter insists on tangible Israeli steps toward a two-state solution before considering a full normalization with Tel Aviv. While the ever elusive two state option was initially a secondary consideration in normalization talks, Israel's brutal and unprecedented military assault on Gaza, which over 22,000, mostly women and children, have been killed, that figure is now around 30,000 if we estimate those who are likely under the rubble, has now become a central component for Saudi Arabia. Riyadh has its own motivations, both internal and external, and is firmly adhering to the two state path, with growing discontent in the U.S. over Biden's handling of the region's crisis. The White House is in need of a diplomatic breakthrough in West Asia to secure some electoral gains. Recent polls, however, which will almost certainly be exacerbated by last week's unprovoked strike on Yemen, continue to indicate U.S. voter dissatisfaction, 57%, with Biden's management of West Asian uh, policy, the Palestinian Authority's uncertain future. Confused matters further. The U.S.-backed Israeli military establishment has different calculations than the Netanyahu-led government it serves. Okay, the military aims to demobilize reservists and shift to a less severe, more targeted level of aggression in Gaza. What nice guys the U.S. is, right? Aligning with U.S. advice while simultaneously preparations are being made for a potential Israeli escalation with Lebanon. That's going to be a disaster, by the way. The Lebanese are going to hand the Israelis their collective head. Much is unknown about the ongoing coordination between the Israeli military and the Pentagon in terms of whether they're willing to undermine Tel Aviv's goals and tactics, other than their joint concern that Israel's right-wing government pursues personal interests over strategic considerations. But avoiding a West Bank conflagration is a major concern for both. Hence why this was a focal point of Blinken's visit with Abbas and his shuttle diplomacy with the Saudis. The threat of a West Bank escalation was also used as leverage by the U.S. to wrest Palestinian clearance funds back from the Netanyahu government. Key to the White House efforts is securing the weak and ineffectual PA as its main Palestinian partner moving forward and rebranding it as a safe alternative to Hamas and other resistance factions in Gaza. Since the 7th of October, the PA has sought political cover by tightly aligning itself to the stances of Egypt and Jordan, who warn Israel and its allies against population displacements in Gaza and the West Bank. This has led to increased engagements between Ramallah, Cairo, and Amman, which suits Washington's agenda well. None of these things, however, disguises the fact that an unpopular Palestinian Authority, riding on the shoulders of the now utterly despised American enablers of Gaza's collapse, is seeking to unseat a popular Palestinian resistance while poorly managing multiple war fronts with an Israeli government immune to U.S. demands of peace. Washington couldn't deliver a Palestinian solution in the decade since peace was struck in Oslo. So what can it possibly do now? Wealthy Arab states are not interested in carrying the load of the Palestinian Authority, when even the U.S. can barely keep it on life support. Even the UAE leader Mohammed bin Zayed, the Arab point man for the Abraham Accords with Israel, said to Netanyahu, quote, to go ask Zelensky, unquote, when the Israeli PM came begging for money to prop up the Palestinian Authority. The Israeli PM, of course, is Netanyahu. So band-aid solutions are only ever temporary. It takes a mere few drops of water to destroy their efficacy, as religious settlers run wild throughout the West Bank, courtesy of the Netanyahu government. The U.S. will be playing full-time nursemaid alone in a vain effort to tend to each and every cut. We could be one wound away from the whole enterprise imploding. Now that I thought was one great, insightful piece and delivering perspectives that you never hear anywhere else.
No, you don't.
I mean, that was, really unique. Okay, we haven't been getting it from a normal outlook, okay, that we attend to. So both the article on the assassinations policy and this article were outstanding pieces of research that people need to know if they're going to understand, okay, the whole picture of what is taking place there. And the obvious concern about an explosion, okay, in the West Bank, okay, is very important actually right now, because with still a huge number of Israeli troops tied down in the Gaza effort, uh, I think the Israeli army is taxed to keep control over the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know to what extent underground forces, in the West Bank have managed to become fairly well armed in recent years. We don't know about that. We have the impression that they have not become so well armed, but I'm sure that there are forces external to the West Bank that may have been over a long period of time now delivering weapons. If so, then maybe the West Bank is the powder keg uh, that is being claimed, okay, in this article. Anyway, I thought that was certainly something to think about. So the next piece, I have some great pieces tonight.
Yes, you do.
Okay, the next piece actually comes from the New Yorker. Uh, okay, and it's by Robin Wright, who is a veteran international relations analyst uh, who's been around for a very long time and is usually on outlets like CNN and establishment outlets of various kinds. But what she has to say is she warns in this article, okay, in the New Yorker, which I don't know if I've shared it. Have I actually shared it? No.
No.
So let me share it now. Okay. But it's a striking title: How 10 Middle East conflicts are converging into one big war. The U.S. is enmeshed in wars among disparate players in Israel, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, okay, and also Yemen. They don't mention, okay, Iran yet, but of course there are Iranian underground forces, uh, in Iraq, in Syria. And their relations with Lebanon and Yemen, okay, are very, very good. On Friday night, a day after the U.S. led attacks on dozens of Houthi military sites in Yemen, President Biden took a few shouted questions during a campaign stop at the Nowhere Cafe. I think that's really ironic. Uh, 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 um, um, in Emmaus, Pennsylvania. Quote, Do you have a message for Iran, unquote, a reporter called out as Biden waited for a smoothie. Quote, I've already delivered the message to Iran, unquote, he replied. Quote, they know not to do anything, unquote. Tehran, he added, did not want a war with the United States. Biden was then asked if he would order more strikes if Houthi rebels, armed, trained, and funded by Iran for years, did not end their drone and missile attacks on commercial and military ships in the Red Sea, a strategic waterway that bridges trade between Asia and Europe. Quote, we will make sure we respond to the Houthis if they continue this outrageous behavior, unquote, he replied. Yet, the U.S. strikes on the Houthis appear unlikely to curtail confrontations in the Red Sea or tensions anywhere in the Middle East. So here is Robin Wright not giving us the normal propaganda we get from establishment sources, telling us what she really thinks. On Friday, the International Crisis Group warned that, quote, a military response to Houthi attacks may have symbolic value for Western nations and may curb certain Houthi capabilities, but will have limited overall impact. They could even make things worse, unquote. The Yemeni rebels are, quote, buoyed by popular support for siding with Hamas in Gaza and gaining lopsided leverage over international commerce, the ICG concluded. Nearly 15% of the world's seaborne trade passes through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. The Houthi attacks, which have accelerated since November 19th, have already affected almost 50 nations, President Biden said in a statement on the U.S. response. Further, American and British forces launched 150 missiles and bombs that hit 60 military sites in more than 24 locations, in Yemen. Yet the Houthis reportedly still have the vast majority of their military assets. Like Hamas, the Houthis, quote, feel empowered to have their way at a bearable cost, unquote, the ICG said. Uh, so actually both militias are pulling the world into their conflicts and hyping their causes. On Sunday, the Houthis fired at a U.S. warship in the Red Sea. On Monday, they hit a U.S.-owned container ship. On Tuesday, the Houthis struck another container ship, and the U.S. fired at 4 more sites where missiles were about to be fired. The escalation and the inherent dangers for the future reflect the merger of crises in the Middle East. 10 conflicts among diverse rivals or in different arenas over disparate flashpoints and divergent goals are now converging. For all the recent punditry warning about a wider war, the trajectory has long been obvious. And for all the American warships, troops, and diplomats deployed in the Middle East over the past 100 days, the U.S. had produced little, if anything, beyond greater vulnerabilities. Quote, the U.S. appears pretty disconnected from regional realities, which may have been an intentional approach to enable withdrawal, unquote. Julianne Barnes-Dacey, the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, told me, quote, but now that Washington has been sucked back in by the Israel war, it's looking pretty lost, unquote. Quote, the spiraling momentum, quote again, makes it all but impossible for the U.S. to unilaterally impose its will upon the region, unquote. The confluence of conflicts is dizzying. Israel faces four distinct front lines. It has fought Hamas on the southern border since the October 7th attack that slaughtered 1,200, which, by the way, those 1,200 were not all slaughtered by Hamas. It turns out that perhaps most of the 1,200 were actually slaughtered by Israelis trying to retaliate, against Hamas. Meanwhile, Hezbollah has launched some 700 attacks from the northern border with Lebanon in solidarity with Hamas. The two militant groups, one Sunni, the other Shiite, share strategic goals, but they have different domestic agendas. Hamas did not collaborate with Hezbollah on the offensive, according to U.S. intelligence. They had run largely separate campaigns against Israel until now. Israel still has no peace with 16 Arab governments. Recent progress on the Abraham Accords, designed to end 76 years of Arab-Israeli conflict, has been indefinitely stalled, despite desperate diplomacy by the Biden administration. Saudi Arabia is the linchpin for the guardian of Islam's holy places. Making peace with Israel, amid a war with Palestinians, is untenable without a deal that includes statehood for their fellow Arabs. 96% of Saudis now believe that all Arab states should terminate ties to Israel, according to a poll last month by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. 40% supported Hamas, up from 10% in August. But U.S. intelligence has warned of growing Arab and Muslim support for Hamas, which is designated a terrorist group by the U.S. and Europe. At the Doha Forum last month, I heard from dozens of Arabs who condemned Hamas tactics and disagreed with its ideology, even as they admired or envied its determined resistance to Israel and defiance of U.S. influence. Quote, in this kind of a fight, the center of gravity is the civilian population, unquote. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin acknowledged in December, quote again, and if you drive them into the arms of your enemy, you replace a tactical victory with a strategic defeat, unquote. He noted, quote, it would compound this strategy if all that awaited Israelis and Palestinians at the end of this awful war was more insecurity, more rage, and more despair, unquote. I'm surprised to find something like that coming out of Lloyd Austin's mouth. Israel's fourth front is a shadow war with Iran playing out in Syria. It has launched hundreds of airstrikes on Iranian weaponry, military facilities, and forces, as well as on Syrian targets. Those strikes have escalated since October 7th. Days after the Hamas atrocities, Israel bombed the international airports in Damascus, and Aleppo. Israel's greatest anxiety is Iran's nuclear program, which has quietly accelerated since October 7th after slowing down over the summer, the U.S. officials told me. So Wright's got some really good sources, hasn't she? Intelligence sources believe Tehran is closer than ever to having the capability to build a nuclear weapon if it so chooses. Meanwhile, the Houthis fight on three axes. They are a Shiite tribal movement that emerged in the 1990s to revive culture and faith. Over the past decade, they have seized the capital, Sana'a, and strategic territory along the Red Sea. The Houthis account for about a third of the 35 million people in Yemen, the Arab world's poorest country. Their insurgency against, I have to add, that population is nearly the equivalent of Canada's. Their insurgency against the corrupt Sunni government became a regional conflict in 2015 when a Saudi-led coalition facilitated by U.S. intelligence and weaponry launched a naval blockade and more than 25,000 airstrikes on the Houthis. as Iranian military support for the Yemeni rebels simultaneously expanded. The conflict was increasingly framed as a proxy war between Riyadh and Yemen and Saudi Arabia, which began in April, has stagnated amid the Israeli Hamas hostilities. Oh, I'm sorry. Uh, a UN backed peace initiative between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, which began in April, stagnated among uh, uh, the Israel Hamas hostilities. Until the Gaza war, Yemen's situation ranked as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, according to the UN Refugee Agency. Hundreds of thousands have died, more than 4 million people have been displaced, and 21 million people are dependent on humanitarian aid to survive. 5 million face famine, and there are a million suspected cases of cholera. Meanwhile, the economy of Yemen has collapsed. The U.S. has been increasingly drawn into Yemen's crisis. Under both Republican and Democratic administrations, America has interdicted weapon shipments from Iran to the Houthis. Last week, naval forces captured a dhow carrying Iranian missile warheads bound for Yemen, but lost 2 Navy SEALs who were swept away by swells in the Arabian Sea. Separately, the Pentagon has carried out almost 400 counterterrorism operations, killing more than 1,000 people on Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. In 2002, the Houthis' founding civilization was, quote, God is the greatest, death to America, death to Israel, curse the Jews, victory to Islam, unquote. Israel's bombardment of Gaza has inflamed public fury after the deaths of more than 24,000 Palestinians, the majority reportedly women and children, and the destruction of half of all buildings in Gaza while spawning famine conditions, homelessness, and poverty, all in a mere 100 days. Over the past week, the Houthis have fired missiles and drones at Israel while launching 30 attacks on international shipping, including U.S. warships off their shore. Quote, we, the Yemeni people, are not among those who are afraid of America, unquote. Abdul Malik al Houthi, the militia leader, said in a televised speech on January 11th on X. Ali al Kahum, a senior Houthi official, boasted, quote, the battle will be bigger and beyond the imagination and expectation of the Americans and the British. On other front lines, U.S. forces are still deployed in Iraq and Syria to contain remnant cells of the Islamic State, whose caliphate collapsed 5 years ago. They have felt the spillover from the Israel Hamas war too. Since mid October, Americans have been targeted 130 times by drones, rockets, mortars, and missiles, though not from ISIS. The attacks have been carried out by diverse militias in the so-called axis of resistance, a network spawned by Iran that includes major movements in 4 countries and cells in others. They have launched almost 80 attacks on the 900 U.S. forces in Syria, 900 soldiers that we have there, and more than 50 strikes on the 2,500 Americans in Iraq. Dozens of Americans have been injured. The U.S. is now hitting back. On Christmas Day, U.S. airstrikes killed several members of Kataib Hezbollah, an Iraqi extremist group, and destroyed 3 of its facilities. On January 4th, a U.S. airstrike killed the ranking commander of another Iraqi militia, Harakat al-Nujaba. In the labyrinth of alliances in the Middle East, however, both of the militias are also a wing of the Popular Mobilization Forces, an array of Shiite militias, which are officially under the command of the Iraqi army, which the American forces have deployed to assist in the ongoing campaign against ISIS. Boy, this is so confusing. Baghdad condemned the assassination as a, quote, flagrant violation, unquote, of its sovereignty and security. The next day, Prime Minister Shia al Sudani called for American forces in Iraq, which in turn oversee the U.S. troops in Syria, to leave, but albeit without a date. Last but not least are the tensions between Washington and Tehran, which date back to the 1979 Islamic Revolution and have only intensified over the decades. The U.S. holds Iran responsible for the deaths of hundreds of U.S. forces in Lebanon, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In the Israel-Hamas war, they now face each other with existential stakes for their allies, which spill over into other parts of the region. Overnight, on Monday, Iran fired missiles near the U.S. consulate in Erbil, as well as a military base used by the U.S. forces. The Revolutionary Guards claim that the operation targeted a Mossad spy center in northern Iraq, quote, responsible for developing and launching espionage operations and planning terrorist activities in the region, especially against Iran, unquote. The State Department called the attacks, quote, reckless, unquote. The tragic irony is that both Washington and Tehran want to avoid further conflict. Quote, we're not looking for a war, John Kirby, the Strategic Communications Coordinator for the National Security Council, said to reporters on Tuesday. Quote, we're not looking to expand this, unquote. The merger of multiple wars was almost inevitable. Dan Kurtzer, a former U.S. ambassador to Israel and Egypt, who was involved in the U.S. peace process under both Democrats and Republicans, told me the dearth of viable ideas and isms has created space for extremist movements to fill a void, sometimes by default. Quote, those movements have gained legitimacy at the expense of very ineffective secular movements, unquote, he said. Quote, one long trend is a growing sense that Islam has better answers to the problems in the region than secular non-Islamic states, unquote. One other factor is the maturity and the depth of the non-state actors. Israel fought 4 wars with neighboring Arab governments between 1948 and 1973. Since then, however, all its conflicts have been with malicious non-state actors, of course. The Palestine Liberation Organization, Hezbollah, Hamas, and now the Houthis. Okay, the militias in the axis of resistance have been around for 2 generations. Their fighters are now battle-hardened and better armed, capable of making their own weaponry. If the Axis simultaneously unleashed their collective might on Israel, they would have, quote, overmatch, unquote, or capabilities to prevent an adversary from fully defending itself. A third factor, so she's saying, if they were to combine together, their capabilities would make it impossible for the Israelis to fully defend themselves. The third factor is the failure of U.S. foreign policy. From the Second World War through the 1990s, the military deployments were usually accompanied by diplomatic initiatives. But the U.S. response to threats since the 9/11 attacks in 2001 has been to act militarily. Quote, this is larger than the Gaza war or the Houthis firing missiles, unquote, Kurtz said. Quote, diplomacy has been thrown under the bus. As a result, people across the region have increasingly seen American involvement through the barrel of a gun. with dwindling credibility for its diplomacy. Quote again, it's been like your car falling apart, unquote, he said. And quote again, quote, first the carburetor goes, then the oil, the fluids, and the wires, and then you're stuck sitting on the side of the road, unquote. In a last dish effort to pressure the Yemeni rebels, the United States formally added Ansar Allah to the official name of the Houthi party, to the list of, quote, specially designated global terrorist groups, unquote, on Wednesday. It also imposed sweeping sanctions on a militia that controls the most territory in the poorest country in the Middle East. Quote, these attacks fit the textbook definition of terrorism, Jake Sullivan, a national security advisor, said. Quote, they've endangered U.S. personnel, civilian mariners, and our partners, jeopardized global trade, and threatened freedom of navigation, unquote. The sanctions, which will have some carve outs for humanitarian resistance, will not go into effect for 30 days to allow countries and non government agencies time to decide what to do about shipments ordered or en route. And if the Houthis ended their attacks, the U.S. would be willing to review the designation, the administration said. But the Houthis, like other groups in the axis of resistance, have vowed not to stop until the Gaza war is over, and that's nowhere in sight. So that was another really fantastic article, very, very wide ranging, trying to teach people about how wide ranging the Middle Eastern conflicts are and to teach them about the potential for those conflicts to come together in a regional war that endangers peace throughout the whole of Western Asia and, of course, may begin to involve other great powers, as well, and bring into the equation then the possibility of nuclear war, depending upon how those other powers get involved. And of course, there's already the potential for nuclear war because if there is a coming together, of these fronts, that are identified, uh, uh, and they represent a threat to Israel as time goes on, then if things go too badly for the Israelis, there is always their threat of using their nuclear warheads to try to wipe out these movements. Of course, their use of nuclear power would be very dangerous to them, but if their existence is threatened, there is the Samson doctrine, that they may turn to. And if they do start, a nuclear war, then of course the whole world may quickly become involved. Now, uh, I want to go to a fourth article here. Uh, I don't think we have anybody here listening to this, or watching this. This is strictly aftermarket.
Oh, it is? Okay.
I mean, it looks like it.
Mm.
It looks like we have only one viewer. That may be Steve Wolfbrand.
Okay. Then you don't know Twitter too.
Huh? Sorry. What about Twitter?
You don't know Twitter. People are watching on Twitter. Sometimes it doesn't show up.
Yeah, I know. I know there are people watching on Twitter, and there may be. Uh, I'm sure this might get a lot of views on Facebook as we move along.
Hmm.
At the same time, there don't seem to be any right now, but that's okay.
Right. That's okay. Yes.
That's okay. It's worthwhile doing anyway. This next article is called Israel's Vietnam and Ours. Everything that Israel is doing to the people of Gaza, especially killing civilians through intensive aerial bombardment, was prefigured during the American, quote, ground war, unquote, okay, in Vietnam. This piece is by Van Goss, okay, from The Nation. Okay, he's a professor emeritus, okay, I believe. Let me go to the bottom of it and see if he can easily be identified. Yeah, Van Goss is a professor of history at Franklin and Marshall College and co-chair of Historians for Peace and Democracy. So he's not a professor emeritus. He's still a professor at Franklin Marshall, which I believe is in Pennsylvania. Either Pennsylvania or New Jersey. Did they say Pennsylvania there, or did they say New Jersey? I forget. No, I think it's in Pennsylvania, though. But I mean, the Franklin is probably Ben Franklin, and the Marshall is probably John Marshall. Comparisons between Israel's destruction, okay, of Gaza and America's war in Vietnam are becoming more and more overt. See, in campus protests over Gaza, the echoes of outcry over Vietnam. Okay, the New York, the New York Times, December 24th, 2023. Then as now, we see an ever widening divide between the part of the citizenry motivated by shame over the slaughter of innocents versus a political establishment that maintains its killing regime regardless of growing horror, okay, among the world's peoples. Of course, there are differences. The unyielding government, in this case, is Israel, and only secondarily its uneasy enabler, the Biden administration. The protest movement rises here in the United States, led in large part by Palestinian and Arab Americans, while anti-war forces in Israel itself are isolated and repressed. Most tellingly, by the late 1960s, the cutting edge of the movement against the Vietnam War was inside of the U.S. military in mutinies and systematic attacks on officers. There are few such cracks in the IDF, and other than the remarkable solidarity with Palestinians shown by groups such as Tayyush and B'Tselem, most Jewish Israelis embrace their identity as a warrior society, as if there is no other way to survive than total domination. Finally, there is no comparison between the sorry, between the fragmented Palestinian national movement and Vietnam's disciplined struggle for national liberation, which humbled first and then, okay, the American militaries. The Vietnamese constantly reiterated that they were not fighting the American people, whom they counted as allies. Only the U.S. government occupied their country. Hamas makes no such distinction, and on October 7th sought to slaughter as many Israelis as it could. Regarding these two wars, there is a deeper parallel, however, which Americans need to remember. Everything that Israel is doing to the people of Gaza, especially the killing of tens of thousands of civilians through intensive aerial bombardment, was prefigured during the 8 years of the American, quote, ground war, unquote, in Vietnam from 1965 to 73. Then as now, this was a scorched earth strategy to eradicate invisible enemy fighters by destroying everything around them, like setting fire to a haystack to expose, okay, the needle. It was also a strategy focused on minimizing one's own casualties, regardless of how many civilians died in the process. Like their Israeli counterparts today, U.S. commanders in Vietnam were unwilling to order their men to engage the enemy face to face, as the cost would be much greater than their populations would accept. The American troops went on, quote, search and destroy missions mainly as bait to attract fire so that combined air and artillery attacks could then pulverize, the landscape. It's a coward's way of war and also essentially criminal if the laws war as codified, in the Geneva Convention means anything. Nor was this in any way new, as Vietnam's killing fields extended, a military doctrine developed decades earlier. As Benjamin Netanyahu has pointed out with his characteristic Schadenfreude, the indiscriminate number of enemy noncombatants is exactly what the Americans and British practiced in World War II. Well before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, General Curtis LeMay oversaw the firebombing of 63 Japanese cities, killing 100,000 civilians in Tokyo alone. From February 1942 on, the Royal Air Force made no pretense of hitting military targets and simply unloaded as many bombs as it could to destroy civilian morale by, quote, dehousing, unquote, German cities. This was war as a retribution. The tens of thousands of Dresdeners incinerated in February 1945 were the final victims of an RAF, quote, area bombing, unquote, campaign that killed 600,000 civilians, although the Nazis were blamed for beginning this practice, notably the 1940 to 41 Blitz targeting British cities, which killed 40,000. It was actually Britain that first used air power against civilians to put down Iraqi rebels in the 1920s. Boy, isn't this a well researched one? This way of war carried over to Korea, where every city in the north was systematically firebombed before reaching its apogee in Vietnam, where the United States dropped 4 million tons of bombs on rural South Vietnam. For good reason, the historian Nick Turse called his book documenting this carnage "Kill Anything That Moves." An estimated 3 million Vietnamese died in that war, of which 1 million or so were combatants of the People's Army of Vietnam, that is North Vietnam, or the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. Okay, the majority were civilians, bombed, blown up, napalm, shelled, or machine gunned by U.S. forces. And that is the real parallel to what is happening today. If the word genocide is invoked by respected historians to describe the destruction of Gaza, that word surely applies to the U.S. war against the people of Vietnam. No one should read this historical comparison as normalizing the atrocities ordered by Netanyahu and his generals. With methodical efficiency, they have compressed the worst lessons of war as practiced since 1939 into a killing zone of exemplary savagery. But this need not be a moral wasteland. The American war in Vietnam generated the largest mass movement in our country's history, a tidal wave, mobilizing millions of every age and description to say, quote, not in my name, unquote. The United States was forced to withdraw from Vietnam in large part because its citizens no longer supported the war and its soldiers were no longer willing to fight it. Let us hope that an equivalent awakening comes to Israeli Jews, inspired by the powerful organizing of Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now in groups like them here in the United States. May they be a light onto the world, says Von Goss. Wasn't that a magnificent piece? Showing really the origins of the Gazan slaughter in history, the roots of it, where the attitudes came from to create and perform such a thing. Such a thing. And then we get now, to the last, of our articles. Yeah, I was part of the Vietnam movement too, Steve. Big part of it. The final piece I want to cover tonight is the piece that gives its broadcast its title. It's an opinion piece from Common Dreams called Why Joe Biden is a Policy Failure.
Well, we can go on all night with that one.
And the author of it is the exemplary Jeffrey Sachs,
Oh, okay, that's good.
who I sincerely hope will become the next Secretary of State, okay, of the United States of America. I don't know how yet, but I fervently hope for that. This is U.S. President Joe Biden arriving for a meeting at the Eisenhower Executive Office Building in Washington, D.C. on December 13th, 2023. Why Joe Biden is a Foreign Policy Failure is the title of this article. Only an exceptional president could resist the endless war profiteering of this mammoth war machine. But alas, Biden doesn't even try. By Jeffrey D. Sachs on January 15th, 2024. When it comes to foreign policy, the President of the United States has two essential roles. The first is to rein in the military industrial complex, or MIC, which is always pushing for war. The second is to rein in U.S. allies that expect the U.S. to go to war on their behalf. A few savvy presidents succeed, but most fail. Joe Biden is certainly a failure. One of the savviest presidents was Dwight Eisenhower. In late 1956, he confronted two simultaneous crises. The first was a disastrously misguided war launched by the United Kingdom, France, and Israel to overthrow the Egyptian government and retake control of the Suez Canal following a nationalization by Egypt. Eisenhower forced the Allies to stop their brazen and illegal attack, including through a U.S.-sponsored UN General Assembly resolution. The second crisis, I should point out there, it had to be done through a General Assembly resolution because, of course, okay, the UK and Britain were two of the permanent five in the Security Council, so they could veto anything that was done through the Security Council, which they did. So Eisenhower had to go through the General Assembly. Now, the parallel today is that if the UN has to act to put a stop, okay, to what Israel is doing, it can't do it through the Security Council because the U.S. is there to protect Israel. But it can go through the General Assembly. The second crisis was the Hungarian uprising against the Soviet domination of Hungary. While Eisenhower sympathized with the uprising, he's wisely kept the U.S. out of Hungary and thereby avoided a dangerous military showdown with the Soviet Union. Eisenhower's historic farewell address to the American people in January 1961 alerted the public to the growing power of the military-industrial complex. Quote, in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals so that security and liberty may prosper together. Even Eisenhower did not fully rein in the military-industrial complex, especially the Central Intelligence Agency. No president has done so entirely. The CIA was created in 1947 with two distinct roles. The first and valid one was as an intelligence agency. The second and disastrous one was as a covert army for the president. In a latter capacity, the CIA has led one calamitous failure after another from Eisenhower's time till now, including coups, associations, and staged managed, quote, the color revolutions, as in Ukraine, I might add, all of which have produced endless havoc and destruction. For example, okay, the Ukraine war itself has probably produced 500,000 fatalities, though that is disputed. Following Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy brilliantly resolved the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, narrowly avoiding nuclear Armageddon by facing down his own warmongering advisors to reach a peaceful solution with the Soviet Union. The following year, he successfully negotiated the partial nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union over Pentagon objections, and then won the ratification by the Senate, thereby pulling the U.S. and Soviet Union back from the brink of war. Many believe that Kennedy's peace initiatives led to his assassination at the hands of rogue CIA officials. Biden has joined the long line of presidents that have kept classified or redacted thousands of documents that would shed more light on the assassination. So, okay, I have to mention here in this context, uh, see the tie between Jeffrey Sachs's analysis, okay, and what Bobby Kennedy thinks. Bobby Kennedy thinks that rogue CIA officials, okay, had a hand in the assassination of both his uncle, okay, and his father. Okay, and he also has expressed on a number of occasions his appreciation for what his uncle did in creating peace, okay, with the Soviet Union. And he is one of the things he's running on is peace with Russia by ending the conflict, okay, inside, okay, of Ukraine. Now, I believe the conflict there will probably be ended before he gets a chance to be president. But, okay, and of course, I have discussed here on a number of occasions the problems with many positions he has taken and the problems with, with many things he thinks. And at this point, okay, I am not a supporter, okay, of Bobby Kennedy. Okay, for one thing, okay, he's taking big money, and according to the rule, one has to vote against him. So I'm not saying, okay, them for him at this point, but I do want to point out that the way things are developing now with the prosecutions of Donald Trump, okay, on various fronts, and with the continuous decline, okay, in the popularity, okay, of Joe Biden, if Bobby Kennedy can get on the ballot, okay, in enough states, things are shaping up extremely well for him. I don't know what he's going to do about his horrible position, okay, when it comes to Israel. He hasn't been, he's been avoiding talking about the Gaza war here now for a very long time. As it gets worse and worse, there's terrible silence from him that is, extremely immoral. But of course, he believes that he needs money, considerable amount of money, to get on the ballot. He probably does. Uh, I mean, that's going to cost in the many millions, okay, of dollars. And right now, he's taking that money from big money sources, probably including the Israeli lobby. So that's a connection there. But still, things are shaping up very, very well for him in terms of popularity polling, while Trump and Biden go down. He rises. And if the lawfare that is going on is able to put Trump in prison, And in recent days, there have been great gains by the lawyers in many actions. Uh, we could possibly see a Bobby Kennedy presidency. Uh, that is nowhere near as good, okay, as a successful dump the corruption campaign. I mean, I can tell you that, okay, right off. But of course, it would be better, I believe, than either uh, a second term for Joe Biden or a second term for Donald Trump. Of course, there many people will say to you that Joe Biden's not going to run at the last minute. Okay, the Democrats are going to replace Joe Biden without any primaries. They're just going to select somebody, such as say Gavin Newsom, or Gretchen Whitmer. Uh, well, that may be true, and that may be in the cards. Okay, and that may happen, but I think a lot of people are going to be very, very angry about that. And okay, I don't know whether any new candidate that's put up, okay, at the last minute will be able to develop a campaign powerful enough to to win over Donald Trump and to beat off a challenge from Bobby Kennedy as well. So we're just going to have to see, but things are shaping up in a very interesting way. 60 years onward, the military industrial complex has an iron grip on American foreign policy. As I've recently described, foreign policy has become an insider racket with the military industrial complex in control of the White House, Pentagon, State Department, the Armed Services Committee of Congress, and of course, okay, the CIA, all in a tight embrace with the major arms contractors. Uh, we have to mention also the military industrial complex goes further than that. It also includes, okay, the mass media, okay, and various think tanks, okay, and things like that. I forget exactly what the acronym happens to mean, but okay, specifically Ray McGovern has an acronym of his own. Okay, specifically, he doesn't refer to the MIC, to the MIC. Instead, he refers to the Mickey Matt, which includes the military industrial complex and the mass media, okay, and the think tanks, and I forget, whatever else he includes in that. But I think, okay, the Mickey Matt is a very catchy term, okay, to describe uh, the broader complex of people, all in a tight embrace with the major arms contractors. Only an exceptional president could resist the endless war profiteering of this mammoth war machine. Also, in a sense, the mass media are also profiting from the wars because, from their point of view, the wars drive, okay, the viewership. They're always concerned about increasing, the viewership. And so the wars do drive people to watch, okay, the mass media. Uh, and especially, okay, in the context of a presidential race between two candidates who are supporting the war profiteering and the war machine. In other words, war profiteering is going on in or by the mass media as well. Okay, alas, Biden doesn't even try. Throughout his long political career, Biden has been supported by the MIC and has in turn enthusiastically supported wars of choice, also massive arms sales, CIA-backed coups, and NATO enlargement. Biden's 2024 military budget breaks all records, reaching at least $1.5 trillion in outlays for the Pentagon, CIA, Homeland Security, non-Pentagon nuclear arms programs, subsidized foreign weapons sales, other military-linked outlays, and interest payments on past war-related debts. On top of this mountain of military spending, Biden is seeking an additional $50 billion in, quote, emergency supplemental funding for America's, quote, defense industrial base, unquote, to keep shipping munitions to Ukraine and Israel. Biden doesn't have any realistic plans, for Ukraine, and even rejected a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine in March 2022 that would have ended the conflict based on Ukrainian neutrality by ending Ukraine's futile bid to join NATO. Futile because Russia will never accept it. So Ukraine is a big business for the MIC. Tens and potentially hundreds of billions of dollars of arms contracts, also manufacturing facilities across the United States, the opportunity to develop and test new weapon systems. So Biden keeps the war going despite the destruction of Ukraine on the battlefield and the tragic and needless deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. The MIC, and it's hence Biden, continue to shun any negotiations, even though direct U.S.-Russia negotiations regarding NATO and other security issues, such as U.S. missile placements in Eastern Europe, could end the war. In Israel, Biden's failure is even more on display. Israel is led by an extremist government that reviles the two-state solution, according to which Israelis and Palestinians should live side by side in two sovereign, peaceful, and secure states, or indeed any solution that grants Palestinians their rights. Two-state solution is deeply embedded in international law, including UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, and supposedly in U.S. foreign policy. The Arab and Islamic leaders are committed to normalizing and securing safe relations with Israel in the context of the two-state solution. Yet Israel is led by violent zealots who make the messianic claim that God has given Israel all the land of today's Palestine, including the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. These zealots therefore insist on political domination over the millions of Palestinians in their midst, or their annihilation or expulsion. Netanyahu and his colleagues don't even hide their genocidal intentions, though most foreign observers don't fully understand the biblical references that the Israeli leaders invoke to justify their ongoing mass slaughter of the Palestinian people. Israel now faces highly credible charges of genocide in the International Court of Justice in a case brought by South Africa. The documentary record presented by South Africa and others is as clear as it is chilling. Israeli politics is not the politics of pragmatism, and certainly not the politics of peace. It is the politics of biblical apocalypse. Biden, nonetheless, provides Israel with the munitions to carry out its massive war crimes. Instead of acting like Eisenhower and pressing Israel to end its slaughter in contravention of international law, including the Genocide Convention, Biden continues to ship arms, and ammunition, and other munitions, even bypassing congressional review to the maximum extent he can. The result is U.S. diplomatic isolation from the rest of the world and the growing involvement of the U.S. military in a war that is rapidly and all too predictably expanding across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen. In the recent UN General Assembly vote backing political self-determination for the people of Palestine, the U.S. and Israel stood alone, save 2 votes. Specifically, Micronesia, bound by compact to vote with the United States, and also Nauru, population 12,000. So, America's foreign policy is rudderless, with a president whose only foreign policy recipe is war. With the U.S. already up to its neck in the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, Biden also intends to ship more arms to Taiwan, despite China's strident objections that the U.S. is thereby violating long-standing commitments to the One China policy, including the commitment made 42 years ago in the U.S. PRC joint communique okay, that the U.S. government, quote, does not seek to carry out a long-term policy of arms sales to Taiwan, unquote. Eisenhower's dire prophecy has been confirmed. The military-industrial complex threatens our liberty, our democracy, and our very survival. So that was another really terrific article, historically grounded. It had really terrific analysis. Uh, it outlines plainly why Joe Biden is a foreign policy failure, but it fails to recognize two things that I love to emphasize, okay, myself. Okay, because to me, they really, really hit home. In Ukraine, Joe Biden exposed us to the first substantial risk, okay, of nuclear war in 40 years, okay, against a nation that has a capability we do not have, hypersonic missiles specifically, and more warheads than we have. And I also point out that in the Middle East intervention, there is also, okay, a nuclear risk because of Israel's possible use, okay, of nuclear weapons if it gets into a desperate situation. So we're exposed to a nuclear risk there. Okay. Also, you heard in one of the other articles that we read here tonight, okay, that Iran is now moving again to nuclear arm itself, and that it is very close to having, okay, a nuclear capability. And of course, that will increase the risk of nuclear war in West Asia. So, this is a horrible thing. It's a horrible thing, and it's a failure of foreign policy. What is, okay, what is the main goal, or what should be the main goal of the president in foreign policy? It should be keeping the people of the U.S. Safe. It should not be to aggrandize the power of the United States. What is the ultimate duty of the president when it comes to foreign policy? It is to keep us all safe. The first president to give us a risk of nuclear war since the middle 1980s is a failure of a president, a monumental failure. A monumental failure. We need to always remember that he is a monumental failure when measured against all of the other presidents that we have had since the middle 1980s, when the United States and the Soviet Union laid to rest a real possibility, okay, of nuclear war. So, on that note, I am done with what I had to say. Okay, Dee, do you want to add anything?
I think you covered everything. I'm just so disgusted. I really am.
Yeah, I thought too that all those articles, taken together, uh, okay, given the historical background of all this, it's really reprehensible.
Hmm.
It's really disgusting. The whole historical record culminating in the involvement with Israel in this war.
Hmm.
It is simply disgusting. A few comments from Stephen Wolfbrand. Epstein didn't kill himself. He was Mossad. He had close connections to Mossad. Yes, he did. And may even still be alive. Seth Rich was murdered for leaking to WikiLeaks. This country is filthy. I think all the articles indicated that the total impact of these articles uh, is to validate Steve's opinion that this country is filthy. Steve says, and even may still be alive. Sorry for leaking. Damn autocorrect. Steve says, shared to Facebook. Okay, and Cambodia. Yes, Cambodia
Mm-hmm.
was disgusting. Steve says, I was part of that movement. He says 9/11 was an inside job. Building 7 didn't kill itself. Dancing Israelis, George H.W. was involved. Yeah, dehousing, what dehousing means, of course, is taking down all the buildings in Gaza so people don't have housing. And we were practicing that in other wars too. The British were practicing it. It's been going
Come
on.
on, little boy. I'm sorry.
That's all right. The Israelis learned this from history. They learned it from somewhere. And they learned it as much from the Western powers as they learned it from the Nazis. So we have to keep all of that in mind. But now it's time to say goodnight. Okay, I thank you, Steve, for coming. I would say I thank you all for coming, but okay, I think you're the only one left. Okay, except for maybe D also.
Yes, I'm here. Colby's carrying on here. Yeah, I gotta get going. Yeah, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share, share, share.
Share, and note. Uh, are you likely to have a show tomorrow night, D?
Yes, I'm having a show tomorrow.
Okay, so D will have a show at 8 o'clock. Okay, tomorrow, and I will have a Dump the Corruption show tomorrow as well. So both of us will have shows tomorrow, one at 8 and one at 9. And so we will look for you for those shows. Please do buy us coffees, and please do visit occasionally my Patreon site. Thank you very much. There's a third person here now. I don't know who that is. If I had to bet, I would say it's probably the late arrival of Andy Candy. But I'm not sure about that. Okay. Anyway, whoever that third person is, thank you very much for showing up. And okay, I guess D and I will see you tomorrow. Good night.